Today, you're going to tour, for the first time ever, the home, bookshelves, and presidential memorabilia of three-time New York Times bestselling author Jonathan Alter. Jonathan is perhaps best known for his book on FDR's first 100 days, titled The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope. President Obama and President Biden have both spoken about reading his first 100 days book, published in 2006. Both men read Alter's book while they were preparing to serve as president and vice president in 2008 for President Obama's first term, and then several years later, as president-elect, Biden read Alter's book a second time. I've collected the interview audio and video, including a 60 Minutes interview with President Obama, where both presidents mentioned Jonathan's book in the first link in the description. It's fair to say that Jonathan's Defining Moment book is required reading for future presidents preparing for their first 100 days in office. Besides Alter's book on FDR's first 100 days, he's also the author of the first independent, full-length biography of President Carter, titled His Very Best, published in 2020. Jonathan has interviewed 9 of the last 10 presidents, and as you will learn and see later in the tour, he even met Martin Luther King Jr., who visited his family home when he was 8 years old. Alter previously served as a columnist and senior editor for Newsweek and is currently a political analyst for NBC News. He was also an executive producer for a TV show called Alpha House, which was Amazon's first original TV series in 2013. This is my third interview with Jonathan Alter. You can find links to the previous interviews in the description, where we discuss in more depth his presidential writings. Alter is also the author of 2 books on President Obama, titled The Promise, President Obama Year 1, published in 2010, and The Center Holds, Obama and His Enemies, published in 2013, as well as his most recent book on President Trump, titled American Reckoning, Inside Trump's Trial and My Own, published in 2024. You can enter to win a copy of Jonathan's American Reckoning by visiting the first link in the description. Make sure to check out the timestamps in the description if you want to skip around. For example, you may want to skip to the part near the end where Jonathan takes us through his presidential biography bookshelves, or to the segment where we tour his writing room and view his desk setup where he writes his books. Jonathan will also be showing us the actual letters he's received from President Clinton with a rare Sharpie inscription, plus a 2017 thank you letter from First Lady, Secretary of State, and presidential candidate Hillary Clinton from when she visited Alter's home several years ago. You also get to see a handwritten letter from First Lady Rosalynn Carter, plus much, much more. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the tour with Jonathan Alter.
Now we're walking into our house, which was built in 1879 in the administration of Rutherford B. Hayes. It's a Queen Anne Victorian, and a famous architectural critic named Vincent Scully from Yale wrote a famous book that any architecture student reads called The Shingle Style and the Stick Style in America. And he has this house in the book as an example of Queen Anne architecture. And what you're looking at right now is the foyer of the house. And Vincent Scully criticized this in his book with a floor plan of our house, saying that the room that you're looking at right now is too big to be a hallway and too small to be a parlor. The living room is right there. We'll go in there in a minute. But the first thing that you see when you walk into our hallway, after you come into the front door, if you look a little bit to your left, is our fireplace. And on top of the fireplace are some books, and that we don't have an up here in any particular order, but there's a 19th century encyclopedia of America. Then there's a book by a guy named Ben Hecht, who co-wrote The Front Page, the great play, and he was a legendary Chicago newspaper man. And, you know, as a journalist, I'm very interested in old books by people in journalism. Then there's a book, you can just barely make out the spine. It's Theodore Roosevelt's letters to his children. Then we have History of American Journalism, a very, very old book about Andrew Jackson. And then we come on first edition Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. Now, I think many of your viewers will know that these were, next to the Bible, the biggest selling books of the 19th century. I'm pretty sure I'm right about that. There might be one or two other, well, I guess actually Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, who was President Grant's editor on these books and got them published. Grant wrote them because he was dying of cancer and he had lost his fortune in a stock market crash. And but it's pot. When I made the statement that they were the best-selling books of the 19th century, I should have said nonfiction. Yeah, because obviously there were people like Mark Twain who sold more books. Then there's a very early life of Lincoln. I'll get back to that a little bit later on when I show you my Lincoln collection. And a famous press critic named George Seldes, then a very famous turn of the last century journalist named Richard Harding Davis, one of his books. And then we just have some other kind of fun books here, like Fun with Dick and Jane. You see there an early edition of that. Some of you might remember reading Dick and Jane books when you were a kid. And then a few books here that are of real personal interest, just that you see first thing. So you see the story of Franklin D. Roosevelt by Lorena Hickok. And Lorena Hickok was Eleanor Roosevelt's lover in the 1930s, as I explain in The Defining Moment, and has been recounted in other books. She's a very talented former newspaper woman who helped FDR immensely to make sure that his New Deal programs were actually working on the ground. And but the reason I have this book up here is that it's part of a series of books for kids. This one is about FDR, but I read dozens of them when I was a kid, most of them from the Landmark book series. And next to that is a book about the little giant, Stephen A. Douglas, Abraham Lincoln, who I'm going to be telling you a little, maybe more than you want to know about a little later on. Ran against for president in 1860. Then Charlotte's Web. We have our daughter, Charlotte Alter, who's a journalist and author, and that book is very meaningful in our family. And then the reason we have Cheaper by the Dozen is that story, which became a movie by Gilbreth and Carey, takes place in Montclair, New Jersey, where we live.
Wow.
And you can see Abraham Lincoln next to that. And as I keep going right, we get to my political button collection, which was mostly put together by my late father and is mostly from Illinois campaigns, including that of my late mother, who ran a very early environmental campaign for the what's now called the Water Reclamation District in Chicago. And you can see the button for Joanne Alter and in there with a little drop of water. Joanne Alter was the first woman elected to county office in Cook County, which is the Chicago area. And I think of my mother as the Jackie Robinson of women in Chicago politics. And so a lot of these buttons, some of them fairly rare, were my father and now I have collected over the years, and a lot of them have stories connected to them. My parents met working in the Adlai Stevenson for president campaign in 1952, or they didn't meet there, but they worked together in that campaign the year they were married. And then I've got other things like, presidents, you see Kennedy cards there, Stevenson cigarettes.
And then Air Force One cards or candy or...
Well, I've traveled on Air Force One a few times, but I don't have them out here. I have them in a drawer. It's a good idea, though. I should probably put my
What'd you call this kind of desk? It's a unique kind of old-fashioned.
Yeah, it's just an antique that we. It's not worth anything particularly, but and then you can see we do have some Republicans, Nixon and Agnew, and my oldest button is from William Jennings Bryan in 1896, and then I've got a bunch of others from the 20th century. Here's an unusual one, Alf Landon. You can see there's a kind of a sunflower on it. That's because he came from Kansas, the sunflower state. And then some of my Jimmy Carter related memorabilia. These are Jimmy Carter and his Vice President Walter Mondale medals, a Jimmy Carter coaster. I also, you'll see other Jimmy Carter. There's a Jimmy Carter bobblehead. And then here's a prayer card from the funeral of John F. Kennedy. And I also have there's a bullet from the Battle of Gettysburg, an original bullet, which I went there so many years ago that you could still get them. And not here, but somewhere else, I have a ballot that had Abraham Lincoln's name on it when he ran for delegate. He was elected a delegate to the 1840 Whig convention, and they spelled his name wrong, but I can't show that to you, so you might not want to see.
You know what year was, or what campaign was the first one with pins?
That's a good question. If I was more of an expert on buttons, I could tell you that, but they go back to really before there were pins, there were kind of little ribbons for candidates, and then those in the mid 19th century, those turned into stick pins. But they had a lot of memorabilia from candidates that really started in 1840 when William Henry Harrison was elected president as a Whig, and he caught pneumonia giving his inaugural address and died a month after taking office. But he had been a war hero, and he had the first kind of recognizable campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because he won the Battle of Tippecanoe, and he then, turned over the presidency to John Tyler, who served all but 1 month of what should have been Harrison's term in office. Just to continue on presidents for a bit before I start to show you other bookshelves. So this is our piano, and on top of the piano, we have one of my prized possessions, which is a it's not really a voting machine. It's a trainer for how to vote on one of the old metal voting machines in Chicago. And the election here is the election of 1960. And what they would do is they would, the precinct captains, I think everybody knows what the daily machine was like. And my mother ran first with and then against the daily machine in her career in politics.
Could you move a little closer while you're...
Yeah, if you were a new voter, you the precinct captain or somebody in the polling place would show you, quote unquote, how to vote. And you could vote the straight party tickets. Or here, it's John F. Kennedy. You can see John F. Kennedy, president, and Paul Douglas was a wonderful senator from Illinois for Senate. Otto Kerner for governor. He went to jail after he was governor. And they'd say, just go like this. You just, oh, I just voted the straight Democratic ticket. Not a lot of people were voting the straight Republican ticket for Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge in Chicago at that time.
Could you show that again? Because
the
video kind of hiccuped when you pulled the lever.
Okay.
I don't know if it wasn't clear when you pulled the lever for Democratic what happened.
Oh, it wasn't? Okay. Let me do that again.
Yeah.
Hold it still. So the precinct captain or somebody else in the polling place would show an old lady or a new voter, oh, here's how you vote. You just pull this lever. Oh, look at that. The straight Democratic ticket. You just have to pull one lever when you go in the polling place. And this is how they would, quote, train them to vote.
So is that a mark on a piece of paper, or it just registers some system?
The voting machine looked exactly like this.
Right.
So when you'd go, this is what you would see until the 1980s, from early in the 20th century, or you'd vote on these metal voting machines. And what you are seeing right now is exactly what the voting machine looked like inside, made by the same company, Automatic Voting Machine Corp., Jamestown, New York. So this is it's called a trainer. And up here in the left-hand corner, directions voting. First, move red handle to the right and leave it there. So this is how somebody could be trained how to vote. And as I think we all remember from reading history, that's what, the daily machine hoped you would do, is just pull that one lever and it would be Democrats. Now, this is a book that I'm going to close it, called City Parks. And the reason that we have it on top of the piano is that several years ago, I wrote an essay in this book about Lincoln and Grant Parks in Chicago. And it's, I'm not quite sure why we have it here, but it's about my growing up just across the street from Lincoln Park. And you can see there's a picture with Alexander Hamilton's statue directly across the street from where I lived when I was born. And behind it is a Mies van der Rohe designed building. And in front of it, which you can't see, is a park bench with a plaque that is devoted to my late father, Jim Alter, who was head of an organization called Friends of the Parks, which to this day helps sustain Chicago parks. And I write in this essay about everything from being a very small boy, remembering when my parents left to attend the Democratic Convention in 1960 in Los Angeles, one of my very first memories before I was 3, all the way to my being in Grant Park up close as Barack Obama delivered his victory speech on election night 2008. Some letters here. So this is, again, one of my prized possessions. It's a letter from Franklin Roosevelt to Edward Kelly, the mayor of Chicago in 1939. And here's a letter that Rosalynn Carter wrote me a few years ago during the time I was working on my biography of Jimmy Carter. And here's a letter that Hillary Clinton wrote to my wife and me after she came to our home in 2017 after she lost the presidency to Donald Trump. And then here's
why did she visit? What was the occasion?
Oh, that's so she came up. She was signing books at a wonderful bookstore called Watchung Booksellers in Montclair, New Jersey, and I had known Hillary Clinton for quite a long time at that point. And when I heard she was coming to Montclair, I invited her over. And instead of having a bunch of old people to greet her for this little reception that we had for her, we just had young women, many of them from the neighborhood.
Wow.
And girls, some young girls were there as well with our family. And here's a letter that the reflection is making it a little bit hard to see. It's from Bill Clinton. And it was after my second book about Barack Obama came out. That one was called The Center Holds. And
I thought only Trump wrote in Sharpie like that.
Yeah. Bill Clinton, sends me a nice letter, but then in the inscription, he says, "You didn't say that the post-speech polls showed a 5 to 6 point bump for the president, but what you did say was generous and kind. Thanks." In other words, he read the book carefully enough to know that I didn't give him enough credit, he said, for his convention speech at the 2012 convention in Charlotte, where he helped bolster the Obama campaign, and he just wanted a little more credit for it. There's me with our now older granddaughter. So then very quickly, just because you're getting to know some of my interests. So these are wood carvings from the far interior of China, and it's an area of China called Taiwan, where that was originally a banking capital, and during the Cultural Revolution, these wood carvings, which are mostly of economic issues, you can see like economic matters. You can see counting. There's an abacus in one of them. They were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. And when I was in China, I believe in 1997, I'm not sure exactly which trip it was, I found these in a marketplace for no money. And they were kind of a sign of both the old capitalist China of centuries ago and the Cultural Revolution. Then just very quickly here, I don't want to detain you. So here's a Picasso plate that my parents bought on their honeymoon in 1952 for not very much money. And that is a photograph of my late father with the B-24 that he flew 31 missions in over Nazi Germany in World War II.
So that's one of the front wheels.
Yes, that's the front wheel of his B-24. And then this is, he was a bombardier navigator. And this is a this is the bomb release. You can maybe see it there. It says bomb release. And he would toggle that switch to drop the bombs. And that, did quite a bit to help win the war. Then finally on this table, there's a first edition of a book called The Happy Warrior about Al Smith, who was the 1928 Democratic candidate for president. You can see that it's by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And I always get a laugh. Roosevelt was Smith's successor as governor of New York. And this is at the time he wrote the book, but they almost immediately after Roosevelt became governor, they went from political allies to political enemies. And Al Smith felt very bitter toward Franklin Roosevelt, even though when he was president and he knew that Al Smith had been a big investor in the Empire State Building, then the tallest building in the world, and that they had no tenants, and Roosevelt put in a bunch of federal tenants, saving Smith's ass. Smith still wasn't grateful, and he was a great governor of New York, as this little book indicates, but let his bitterness toward FDR get the better of him, which you can read about in Robert Caro's book, The Power Broker, among other places, and also in The Defining Moment, right, my Roosevelt book.
Can you give a 360 of the rest of the room?
Yeah. So this is the living room, and wait, let me start without my finger on there. Oh, so one other thing before we go into the living room, this is a recent painting of
Zelenskyy, yeah,
the president of Ukraine, and see if you could President Zelenskyy, and see if you can see who the artist is.
I can't read. B something.
Joan Baez.
Okay.
Joan Baez. She's an artist as well as a singer, and she was selling those prints to raise money for Ukraine in 2023. So here is our living room. I guess I should talk as I'm doing that. Just to tell you, as I show you our living room, a little bit more about this house. It was designed by a very well-known 19th century architect named Henry Hudson Holly. And he designed the house that Thomas Edison lived in West Orange, New Jersey. And then after he left Menlo Park, Edison's labs in West Orange, which are now a national park site, is where he invented motion pictures and a number of other important Edison inventions. And he later fired Henry Hudson Holly for using inferior building materials in the establishment of his laboratory. But we felt that the building materials in our house that have lasted for nearly 150 years are much better than that of most houses. Here are some of the books that we have in the living room, but I think I'd rather tell some stories and give you a closer look at the ones that we have in the den and the kitchen. So let me now walk into the kitchen. You can edit here.
Are the books in those two bookshelves about certain subjects in particular, or are they just sort of a melange?
The books in those bookshelves are almost entirely nonfiction books about various dimensions of American history and politics.
Okay.
We have fiction in other parts of the house. We have literally hundreds. Well, no, we have more than 1,000 books in this house, in various parts of this house. This is my collection of presidential spoons. And you might see up there's George Washington, and they only go, some are missing, and they only go until the middle part of the 20th century. But if you look really closely and you
I see Teddy. Could you zoom in on Teddy Roosevelt there?
Theodore Roosevelt, you see Taft right next to him. And then Wilson and Harding. And the row ends with Coolidge. Actually, you know what? It ends with Hoover, and it looks like Coolidge is missing. Ooh, I might have to try to do something about that. And the last one here that you see is, now these are out of order. The last down here because of the structure, but the last one in this collection is Eisenhower.
So are those the U.S. Mint?
No. They're
It's a private thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I do have what are called Franklin Mint.
Yep.
Presidents, which is also private. But the U.S. Mint just makes money. They don't do commemorative things from the U.S. Mint. Okay, so these are my bobblehead presidents. Excuse me. Okay, so first there's a campaign poster from my late mother, and this is down here. This is an invoice. You might wonder, why are you showing me an invoice? And if you look closely, you can see that it's shipped to Benito Mussolini, Rome, Italy, sold by Grigsby Grunow, the largest manufacturer of radios in the 1920s before they went under in the crash. Their famous model was called the Majestic. The Monarch of the Air, it was called, and sold to Harry Alter Company. That was my grandfather, Harry Alter. And he bought it from the manufacturer, Grigsby Grunow, and he sold it to Benito Mussolini for $67.85 in 1928.
Wow.
At this time, Mussolini was popular not just in Italy, but in the United States. Very, very popular for several more years. And as I explain in in my book, The Defining Moment, dictator had a positive connotation at the time Franklin Roosevelt came to office. There was even a car that Studebaker made called the Dictator that sold well, which is, I think, a newly relevant fact. Roosevelt decided not to become a dictator, even though he had the opportunity to do so. So these are my Pez dispenser presidents. You can see there's some bobblehead presidents in the back. I used to have a much better collection of bobblehead presidents, but a guest in our home accidentally tipped over a table and several of my bobblehead presidents were wrecked.
What are the bobbleheads made out of?
The bobbleheads are made out of, the cheaper bobbleheads. I have a mix of the cheaper ones, like John Adams is a cheaper bobblehead, but this Nixon and Hoover, these are made out of plaster, and they are of higher quality. You could buy all this stuff online, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So these are my Pez dispenser mostly, and then now we're going into the kitchen, and which until last year dated to the date of my birth, 1957, and it was unchanged. It was a 66-year-old kitchen, which I can show you a picture of if you want. And we did a major renovation. So you're seeing the new kitchen, but we have elements of the old kitchen, like that canopy over the fireplace. And so in our kitchen, one of the more distinctive features is our collection of old toasters, which my late mother collected. And this is only a partial sample of our old toasters. I think they're quite beautiful.
Yeah.
And they're a crowd pleaser. If you want to see what the old kitchen looked like, I can quickly go in on this. That's our daughter and son-in-law on their wedding day in the old kitchen from 1957.
It's a great photo.
I wanted to, in terms of books, I wanted to start on this kitchen bookshelf with the first real influence on me, which was Abraham Lincoln, and I'll show you a picture of me with him later, me with Lincoln, so to speak. But here first are the books, and these are all Lincoln books, and you can see the Library of America, a 2-volume collection of Lincoln's writing. Lincoln was an outstanding self-taught writer. He had read Parson Weems', mostly fictitious biography of George Washington. That's where the chopping down the cherry tree comes from. He'd read that book as a kid in their log cabin by the firelight. But it wasn't until Lincoln got interested in Shakespeare as an adult and consumed all of Shakespeare's plays that he developed his own brilliant writing style, which is collected here in the library by the Library of America. And next to that is a book by David Herbert Donald called Lincoln. And I think it's the single best 1-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln. I'm biased because David Donald was my professor at Harvard in the late 1970s and was a big influence on me. I took classes taught by him on the Civil War and Reconstruction, and then the Jacksonian period. And he also was a wonderful writer. I would recommend any book by David Herbert Donald. Most academics, in my experience, don't know how to write. Certainly, they don't know how to write narrative. And David Donald was an exception. So whether it's this biography or Lincoln Reconsidered, or his biography of Charles Sumner, an important senator from Civil War period, I recommend his work.
You have Team of Rivals?
I do have Team of Rivals, and I'm a big admirer of Doris Kearns Goodwin and friend. I don't have it on this particular shelf, but you'll probably see it later on in my tour. Just to go down, there is an outstanding book by David Blight, a biography of Frederick Douglass. And I believe David Blight won the Pulitzer Prize for this book. It's a first-rate biography of Frederick Douglass. Now on a shelf beneath this are books that have no relation to anything in particular, but there's two of them that I wanted to take note of. So you see there also from Library of America, Breslin, Essential Writings. In 2019, I co-produced and co-directed a documentary called Breslin and Hamill, Deadline Artists, that you can still watch on HBO. And Jimmy Breslin was the most famous journalist of the middle part of the 20th century. And he and Pete Hamill, whose books I recommend also, were like Zelig. They were everywhere. In those years, they were both with Bobby Kennedy when he was assassinated, standing right next to him. They were in Vietnam. They were, ground zero after 9/11. Pretty much any place you can imagine. I was as well in terms of 9/11. Next to that book is The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe. Tom Wolfe's greatest novel. I interviewed Tom Wolfe. It was one of his last interviews for the HBO documentary on Breslin and Hamill. And this book, which is about New York and became a movie with Tom Hanks, is still so much fun to read. Then next to that is a collection of sports stories edited by David Halberstam, who I'll talk about a little bit later when we come across a book he wrote that was very influential in my life.
What about the top shelves? Is there anything? Can we just show people what's there up top?
Yeah. So the top shelf you can see on the left is A Bright Shining Lie by Neil Sheehan, which is one of the best books about the Vietnam War. There is a book about by Rick Atkinson, who is a former Washington Post reporter. He heard what I said earlier about how journalists often, not always, but by and large, write better than academics. So Rick Atkinson, that book is The Day of Battle, but his books about World War II are some of the finest. Then a little further along, you see a book about the famous 1969 tie in the Harvard-Yale football game. And then a book by Frederick Roosevelt that also won the Pulitzer Prize about Dien Bien Phu, which was when the Vietnamese drove the French out of Vietnam. And Roosevelt went on to write a wonderful biography of John F. Kennedy. Then Donna Tartt, The Goldfinch, just so you don't think we're just about nonfiction. Dale Russikoff, a wonderful book called The Prize, which is about the efforts to try to save the Newark public school system. A biography of Francis Perkins, one of the key figures in the New Deal. And then Home Fires, which you can see, there's no book jacket on, by Donald Katz, who is now probably best known as the founder of Audible. And he's one of my closest friends. And before he founded Audible, he was a terrific author. And this book, which I wrote the introduction to the new edition and taped it for Audible, obviously, is about one family on Long Island after World War II. And everything that happens to that family between the end of the war and around 1990. And it's just a fantastic book. Then you see a very fine historian at the University of Texas, Jeremy Surrey, his book, Ron Rosenbaum. I'm a huge admirer of Ron Rosenbaum's work, especially explaining Hitler. And then Simon Schama's book about the French Revolution, which is a classic. But just in terms of my own experience on these other bookshelves that I want to, above our cookbooks, which my wife mostly uses. So this shelf right here is very personal for me. So on the far left is my father's collected journals of his 50-year marriage to more. They were married for more than 50 years, but he collected these journal entries for our family. And then he wrote a book that's very thin volume. It came out under two titles, both of which are available on Amazon. When he had it privately printed, it was called We Were So Young. And then he got a publisher to print it under the title From Campus to Combat. And this tells my father's wartime experience. And what I think is, the battle scenes are exciting. And of course, I like to read about, what was going on in his life. And because for many years, he didn't talk about it. He saw, other B-24s shot out of the sky right in front of him and come back to his base with flak in his flak jacket and look at the empty cots next to him. So he became a citizen who worked for peace. He headed Chicago businessmen against the Vietnam War and worked for Gene McCarthy because of all of the action he had seen. But he captures it wonderfully in From Campus to Combat, or We Were So Young. The reason he called it We Were So Young was he thought that these movies with Gary Cooper showing these guys like in their 30s, he was 22 years old. Mm-hmm. He was flying his B-24. And so then there's a book that my mother is in. It's about women in politics. And then just in terms of my own development, a book about another huge influence on me, Richard Neustadt. And the book is called Guardian of the Presidency. He was one of the greatest political scientists of the 20th century. And his most famous book is called Presidential Power. He was the head of JFK's transition in 1960-61. Worked in the Truman administration, was a huge influence on me. And when I studied with him, I was an undergraduate taking a class at the Kennedy School in 1978. And when I first got to know Dick Neustadt, and then in this book, Guardian of the Presidency, I wrote a chapter about Neustadt and his analysis of the press, because I was Newsweek's media critic for a decade. And there are a lot of other, I think, quite interesting essays about Neustadt's contributions to our understanding of the presidency that are in this book, Guardian of the Presidency, published by Brookings. And then next to that is Washington Goes to War by David Brinkley. So David Brinkley, co-host with Chet Huntley of the Huntley-Brinkley Report, which had tens of millions of viewers a night before he went on to be the host of This Week with David Brinkley on ABC News. David Brinkley gave me my first job out of college. His son had been one of my teachers, he also an eminent historian named Alan Brinkley. And Alan, who wrote Voices of Protest, which you'll see in a little while, about Huey Long and Father Coughlin, he was helping his father write a book about Washington during World War II. And I was hired as a research assistant on this wonderful book about what it was like to be in Washington during World War II. And I got to interview everybody from Franklin Roosevelt's aides to the brain surgeon who did a frontal lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy. All of this when I was only 22 years old. I was the same age my father was when he was risking his life. And then after that, you see the first book that had my name on it. As an editor, I have some pieces inside. It's called Inside the System. And this is a collection, one of several, of Washington Monthly articles. So my first real job after being David Brinkley's research assistant and having done some other things, to make money, just kind of junky writing assignments and, working retail, whatever I needed to do when I was just out of college. My first real job was as an editor of the Washington Monthly. And my mentor was a guy named Charlie Peters, the founder of the Washington Monthly. And I want to go up a shelf now and look at his two books. One is called How Washington Really Works, and the other, which is his memoir, is called Tilting at Windmills. And his name was Charles Peters. And I won't brag on everybody who worked at that magazine for very low pay, usually for 2 years before you go somewhere else, but produced many Pulitzer Prize winners, editors of magazines, in some cases, like John Meacham, my friend John Meacham, both Pulitzer Prize earners, and in John's case, editor of Newsweek. Taylor Branch won the Pulitzer for his biography of Martin Luther King. He's another. James Fallows, Nicholas Lemon, many, Kate Boo, many interesting people were journalists, were proteges of Charlie Peters. And the Washington Monthly is going strong. It's a wonderful magazine, and I urge all of you to take a look at it. Next to that on this upper shelf is the book I mentioned earlier by Vincent Scully, The Stick Style and the Shingle Style, and another book that this house is mentioned in. And then at the end of this shelf is Jimmy Carter's last book, which is called A Full Life. And it's a short autobiography which is selling extremely well now. And, he wrote this in the 5-year period between 2015 and 2020 when I was spending a lot of time with him for my biography of him, his very best, which you see there. And I've kind of gotten a little bit ahead of myself, so I'm going to go to the other side of this bookshelf, and which has books not just by my father, but by me and my children, and my daughter and son-in-law and brother-in-law and brother. So between the lines, you see that with the red spine, that's a collection of 20 years of my Newsweek columns. And then my first book is The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope, which is still by far my best-selling book about FDR's debut in the presidency.
Why do you think that is the most popular?
Well, I don't have a complete explanation, but I'd say the main reason is, it did reasonably well when it first came out. And then after he was elected, Barack Obama went on 60 Minutes and said that he was reading about the challenge that Roosevelt faced when he came to office in 1933, because as you remember, Obama was facing a near depression. And actually things were worse in December of 2008 than they had been even in December of 1932. That's how bad things were. And so Obama was asked, what are you reading? And he said he was reading a couple of books about Roosevelt. And when the New York Times asked which ones, it turned out it was mine, and one by Gene Edward Smith, a fine biography by Gene Edward Smith. Those were the two books that Obama was reading on the eve of his inauguration. And then this was really a kind of a lightning strikes twice situation for me, because as you might imagine, my paperback, surged at that time in late 2008, early 2009. And then in late 2020, Joe Biden went on a podcast hosted by Brene Brown, a very popular podcast. And he talked in some detail specifically about what he got from the defining moment. And he was less interested in what Roosevelt did to rescue the economy, which had been Obama's interest, than in what he called the fragility of democracy that Roosevelt faced on taking office. And then by this time, I already knew that that Biden had read The Defining Moment, because at the convention in the summer of 2020, which, as you remember, was a virtual convention, it was a still picture of Biden at his desk, and you had to use a magnifying glass, but the defining moment was on the desk. And then after he became president, the defining moment was on the table behind him in the Oval Office. So there's a picture of him with Tony Blinken, and you can make out my book and some others, I can't remember which, that are directly behind the president. So as you might imagine, that helped book sales. Then my next book after that came out in 2010, and it's called The Promise, President Obama, Year One. And that, even though The Defining Moment has been my biggest seller, The Promise went the highest on the bestseller list. It went to number 3 because it was the first book about Barack Obama as president. And it's a very detailed and I hope colorful account of his first year as president. It ends with the signing of Obamacare. And then I wrote a sequel called The Center Holds, Obama and His Enemies, that has some things about Trump in there. It was my least successful book commercially, but that's of secondary importance to me, and is again a detailed account of it. It starts on the night of the 2010 midterms, which were disastrous for Democrats, and explains what Obama was up against for the second 2 years of his first term. Through getting it covers a lot about the Obama presidency, if you're interested in that. And then the one that I think of as my most the book that I invested the most in, because it took me 5 years to write, is his very best, and that was the first independent biography of Jimmy Carter and his epic American life. And then my most recent book that came out in October of 2024 is called American Reckoning: Inside Trump's Trial and My Own. And that is part memoir, part cri de coeur for democracy, and part very acerbic coverage of the Trump felony trial that ended with the jury foreman saying guilty, guilty, guilty 34 times, about 15 feet from where I was sitting. I was able to get a seat for every day of that now historic trial. And then next to that is...
You talk about how that happens, how you get a seat?
I do, yes. In American Reckoning, I talked about that. I actually was representing the Washington Monthly, the magazine that I just mentioned, which my Substack newsletter, Old Goats, where I wrote every day from the trial. I was also writing often 2 short commentary pieces a day for the New York Times. But my Old Goats, very extensive coverage of the trial was I worked out a deal with the Washington Monthly where they got to use that coverage, and so I represented them. And whereas the Times or the Post or any other news organization, they only had one pass per news organization to the trial, and so it meant that Maggie Haberman or any of the others couldn't go every day because they had a whole bunch of colleagues that they had to share their seat with. Right. But I was the only one from Washington Monthly, so I was one of really a tiny number. If you include the courtroom artists who were in there every day, and then and that book is the most personal book that I've written, Tim. It has a lot about growing up in this intensely political family in Chicago, and my mother having had her life changed by meeting Eleanor Roosevelt and then Martin Luther King, and coming to our house, which I'll tell you about a little later when we get to that. And just this my love of Lincoln and the way I prepared myself for trying to hold this menace to our system accountable, and my determination to bear witness to what, alas, unfortunately, is the only trial that Donald Trump will face. So I had originally wanted to do what I called the coup trial, cover that, the Jack Smith trial, trying to bring Trump to justice for his coup attempt and trying to overturn the 2020 election. But because of this disastrous Supreme Court decision in the immunity case, that was delayed. And then, of course, Trump Trump's election ended that. So the Stormy Daniels trial, as sordid as it was, is the only trial Donald Trump will face. And I wanted to bear witness to it. And I have a very acerbic, harsh, at least in terms of Trump, account of that and Trump's other sins in this short book, American Reckoning, that begins with me explaining some of how I got there, my upbringing and early experience in journalism. Next to American Reckoning is a book by Charlotte Alter, our daughter, who writes for Time magazine. It's called The Ones We've Been Waiting For. And it came out in 2020. It's about the young millennial politicians who are changing the country. So both AOC and Pete Buttigieg are profiled in that book. And you learn things about them that we haven't seen anywhere else. So
Sounds interesting.
Not surprisingly, and a bunch of others too, a bunch of other young millennial politicians, some of whom have made it and some of whom have stumbled along the way. But it's a very, very good book, very well reviewed, and I strongly recommend it. Then next to that is a book. You can see the names are very small. Rob Warden, Warden, is my older sister's husband, and he is the founder of the Center on Wrongful Conviction at Northwestern University, which some of you might recall got a lot of people off of death row. And this book that's right next to
True Stories of False Confessions.
Yeah, right. So Rob's expertise is these false confessions that people didn't used to think actually existed, but it turns out it's a real problem. And Rob identifies that. And then he's written other books as well on wrongful conviction. And I strongly recommend his work. And then above that, up above, because there's not room on this shelf right now, are some other books by people in my family. Mark Chisano, Charlotte Alter's husband and our son-in-law, wrote a collection of short stories that are wonderful called Marine Park. And they are loosely based on characters that he met when he grew up in Marine Park, Brooklyn. And then more recently, he wrote a book called The Fabulist, which is about George Santos, and who lied about everything about his life and became a congressman. And that's a really fun book that came out in 2023, I believe. It actually came out the day that Santos was finally expelled from Congress, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be a movie. Then just one other thing from my family, and then I'll cut the nepotism. This is a book called Social Emergency Medicine, and my brother Harrison Alter, one of the co-editors of this book, is a pioneer in the field of social emergency medicine, which is using the emergency room to begin to address other social problems that have brought these patients to the emergency room in the first place. So if they've been evicted from their homes and are living on the street and end up in the emergency room, under social emergency medicine ideas, they can be directed to places that might provide them with housing. So I'm very proud of Harrison Alter for his contributions to this important field. Here, even though I don't usually like to keep battered paperbacks in the kitchen, I always want to have this book, The Orwell Reader, handy because I'm a huge admirer of George Orwell. These are some of his essays, including Politics in the English Language, which is one of the most important essays that you can read anytime, but I think especially right now. And then next to that is a book called Common Ground by J. Anthony Lucas. It's about busing in Boston in the mid-1970s, but is, for those of us who work in narrative nonfiction, it's considered to be a masterpiece, and it's one of the best books I've ever read. And currently, I'm the chair of the board of the J. Anthony Lucas Prize Project at Columbia. And we give awards to outstanding works of narrative nonfiction and history. And I think the award that distinguishes us the most, in which I would encourage any authors out there who have book contracts but are having a little difficulty completing their books because they've run out of money from the advance. And so we have something called the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award. In fact, we have 2 J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Awards for authors to help them finish their books. And you can go to the website if you're an author or an editor and you think you might have a good candidate for one of these $35,000 prizes. Then I went over the rest of that shelf earlier when I talked about Charlie Peters. Remember that?
Yep.
That's the distance. So now we're entering my den, and this is I mentioned Van Hecht earlier, and that he was the co-author of The Front Page, a legendary play and movie about journalism. It's also called His Girl Friday. And this poster is from when The Front Page in the 80s played at Lincoln Center, and I managed to get it for free. And so now you enter into our den, and here's our den. You probably see 6 Emmy Awards there, but who's counting? 5 of them were won by my wife for her work at the Colbert Report and CBS Sunday Morning. One of them I won with my co-directors for Breslin and Hamill, Deadline, outstanding historical documentary. So then there's a sculpture by a guy named Jack Carney who worked in bumpers, and this one is of a rabbit, but we have one of a goat and outside of a bear. They're made from car bumpers. It's called a maquette, and this one is of Franklin Roosevelt. You can see his leg brace. And a maquette is what a sculptor does as a kind of a model for the life-size sculpture. And this one is a place near Warm Springs, Georgia, where Roosevelt would go for picnics, both when he was being treated there and then later as governor of New York and as president. And the Secret Service would take the cushion out of the car and put it on the ground so that the disabled president could have something to sit on. And he would gaze out across the valley, and that was where he conceived, as I write in The Defining Moment, one of his most important speeches laying out the ideas behind what became the New Deal. So here are some of my bookshelves in our den. And I don't think you want to hear about all these books, but I'll pick a few to tell you something more about, especially if they were influential for me or ones that I would recommend to people who are interested in I like to collect little oddities. So I bought this thing at a garage sale some years ago, and it has a book, two obscure books. One's called Our Father's House. They're not really books. They're just half of the book is cut off, and you see next to where the pocket watch is that, the book, the spine of the book goes into the wooden back of the, also a flask, a picture of some guy from the 19th century who I don't recognize, spectacles, and what looked like a candlestick holder. So it gives you some idea of the oddities that I have. Now, just a couple of books. I don't want to spend too much time. Just in case you're wondering, how do I get to the higher bookshelves? Is I use this, which I inherited from my late parents, who also lived in a Victorian house. But I think it's a rather attractive little stepladder. So you see, all the way to the left, you see a book called The Last Lion, Winston Spencer Churchill, by William Manchester. And it's an outstanding book about Churchill, the first of 2 volumes. And I reviewed it in 1983 for Newsweek. It was the first article I wrote for Newsweek, so very memorable in that sense. And then next to that is one of Erik Larson's books. I'm sure that you're all familiar with that. And I'm a huge Erik Larson fan. And my favorite is The Devil in the White City, in part because it's from Chicago. It's about Chicago, World's Fair, and that's where I grew up. Then The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I think everybody knows about that, but I'm also a huge William Shire fan. And then a very interesting book about the war in the Pacific called Tears in the Darkness. And then I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of overlooked Hitler books. They were popular in their day, but Hitler and Stalin by Alan Bullock, who wrote a book about Hitler that's probably better known. But Hitler and Stalin is also terrific. And Hitlerland by my former Newsweek colleague, Andy Nagorski, is very a terrific book and not often enough recognized. You see book by Eric Alterman, who I'm often confused with, good writer. George Packer's book, Our Man, about Richard Holbrooke, is a wonderful book. And I was supposed to have lunch with Richard Holbrooke on the day he collapsed and soon died from a heart ailment, and was a big admirer of him. He was a larger-than-life character, who was also an important source on my Obama books. And then it's the beginning of my, in addition to my Obama books, some other books about Obama. And then on this shelf, I think the one that I want to draw your attention to in the interest of time is, well, I'd say two, well, three. I want to talk about three books quickly. So the Korean War is so overlooked. And I think that both of these books, one by Joseph Goulden and one by Don Obergorfer, they're both a good way to understand what happened during the Korean War. And in the case of Obergorfer, his book after the Korean War. Anna Applebaum's book about the Iron Curtain is outstanding. Fred Kaplan, this is a book about the bomb. I don't mean to skip over these other books. They're all good, but I can't go over every book in my collection, unfortunately. But I recommend the work of Fred Kaplan, especially on anything related to nuclear weapons. Okay, now I just wanted to draw your attention to this. This is fantastic art by a friend of mine named Laura Levine. This one is of James Brown, but she does them on a lot of different subjects. Okay, so this is a flag from the Bull Moose Party, 1912, Theodore Roosevelt's campaign. Now let's start on the presidents. And because I think what people want to hear from me is what books I like about presidents. So this is my shelf that contains mostly some of my books related to Bill Clinton. And the two that I would recommend are, well, three. One is POTUS Speaks by Michael Waldman, who was Bill Clinton's chief speechwriter. It's a great view of what it's like to write speeches for a president. Then Robert Reich's book, Locked in the Cabinet. He was his labor secretary, unhappy. Then I'd skip over to First in His Class by David Marron. And that's a terrific biography based on Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting about Bill Clinton, the person before he came to the presidency. Then I'm doing more than two or three. Jeff Toobin, A Vast Conspiracy. That's about a lot of the Clinton scandals and their enemies. And then you see Michael Isikoff, my Newsweek colleague, and he wrote a book called Uncovering Clinton. He's the one who exposed the Paula Jones and Monica Lewinsky story. And then we get into more of the Bush era books, and you see The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright, which is an outstanding book for anybody who wants to understand the origins of 9/11. Then this next shelf is more in chronological order.
Okay.
And you see David McCullough's biography of John Adams, which I'd strongly recommend. A good book by John Meacham about Thomas Jefferson. Another one by John Meacham about Andrew Jackson. Then you see Edmund Morris's work, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt and Colonel Roosevelt. He had a third volume about the Roosevelt presidency that's not here, but he was an outstanding narrative historian. Good short book about the 1912 election by James Chase. And then a good biography of Herbert Hoover by Charles Rappelet. At the end of the row, you see American Dreamer about Henry Wallace. And Henry Wallace, Franklin Roosevelt's second of three vice presidents. Roosevelt's vice presidents were John Nance Garner, then Henry Wallace, then Harry Truman, who succeeded him. And Wallace was a fascinating mid-20th century figure. So in this row starts with Voices of Protest by Alan Brinkley, who I said was one of my mentors. And it's about Huey Long and Father Coughlin, two demagogues of the 1930s and very relevant to our current politics. Then there's, you can see my book there, The Defining Moment. And then there's some other outstanding books about Roosevelt. I can't talk about all of them, but I would recommend, just to mention a couple of them, a book about Eleanor by David Michaelis. Outstanding biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. A book by Jeffrey C. Ward, who wrote what is one of Bill Clinton's favorite books. It's called First Class Temperament, and was very influential for me. It's not on this shelf. I have it upstairs. But this book, Closest Companion, is about Franklin Roosevelt's relationship with Daisy Suckley, who some of you might remember this a little bit from the Bill Murray movie about FDR. But he had a very close relationship with this distant relative, Daisy Suckley, toward the end of his life. And the luminous correspondence, which Jeff Ward edits here, between Roosevelt and Daisy, and you really get a sense of both of them. The Greatest Generation by Tom Brokaw, about my father's generation who fought in World War II, a famous book. So now we're getting into the Supreme Court in this period, and there's a book there in blue, The Court at War, a new book by Cliff Sloan, an outstanding look at the Supreme Court during World War II. And with a lot of echoes of what's going on now, the court was arguably too close to Franklin Roosevelt. We all know about the Japanese internment case, the Korematsu case, but there are a lot of other fascinating World War II cases that are in that book, The Court at War. Now you see The Wise Men by Walter Isaacson and Evan Thomas, two good friends of mine. When this book came out in 1986, it had a big influence on me and helped motivate me to try to write books like Walter Isaacson and Evan Thomas did. All of their books are terrific. And it was important for me personally reading this book. These are about the unelected advisors on U.S. foreign policy in the middle part of the 20th century. FDR by Gene Edward Smith is a good one-volume history of biography of FDR. Truman is the best biography of Harry Truman, and is very relevant for me personally because in my many conversations with Jimmy Carter, we talked about how McCullough, whose book came out 40 years after Truman left office, should be a kind of a model for what I tried to do for Jimmy Carter. My book also came out 40 years after Carter left office, and my aim was to revise the historical interpretation of Carter's presidency. And Carter, when we talked about Truman, who was his favorite president, and McCullough's book, he clearly hoped that I could do the same for him because Truman had left the White House very unpopular, like Carter, and yet people now recognize that he did great things. And I think with Carter's funeral, the country is kind of coming around to where I and other authors have tried to lead it, which is to reassess the presidency and the life of Jimmy Carter.
What is it that's unique about McCullough's work, Truman, that you were trying to model, or that makes it so good?
The revisionism. So what he was able to do with great research and a fluid style was to make readers take a second look at Harry Truman. So he was so unpopular in 1953 when he left office, so much in the shadow of FDR. And we forget mostly because of what McCullough and other authors did. We forget that our reverence for Truman only goes back to the early 1990s. And so, will Carter ever reach Truman's level? Probably not, but he's moving in the right direction. And I am, I just have to say, Tim, I'm proud of the role that his very best is playing in giving people a more sophisticated look at Jimmy Carter beyond mediocre president, great former president. There's much, much more to the story. And, that's what those lonely hours of research when you're writing a book, that's what you hope to do. And for me, it was a once in a lifetime experience trying to revise the historical judgment of an American president. I got a lot of help. Stu Eisenstadt, Kai Bird, and others wrote, also trying to do the same thing. Stu's book came out first, but because he was part of the Carter administration, it wasn't convincing yet. But I think by the time Stu gave one of the eulogies at Carter's funeral in January of 2025, the rest of the country was beginning to come around to this. And my book came out in 2020, and it was the first independent biography of Jimmy Carter. And so
what is Stu's book called?
I think it's called President Carter.
And what's his last name?
And Eisenstadt, Eizenstad, Eizenstadt. Eisenstadt.
Yeah, I mean, that's the book. I found your Carter book, and that's when I initially reached out to you.
Yeah.
I thought it was really excellent. So.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, okay. Here's my shelf of Kennedy books, outstanding books by Herbert Parmet and Frederick Loggevel. The one that had the most influence on me came out many years ago. The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam. No jacket on that book. I have the dog-eared paperback that I first read when I was in high school, somewhere upstairs. And that's about the really talented people around JFK and LBJ who got us into the Vietnam War. And it was tragic, and Halberstam's storytelling had a very big influence on me when I read that book in high school. Now we get to some of my Lyndon Johnson books, and you see that above I have The Power Broker by Robert Caro, because I had that out recently looking something up, and that's Caro's first book and a masterpiece, an American classic. And then, of course, here are 3 of what we hope are going to be 4 volumes on Lyndon Johnson. I'm just reminded of a story involving Bob. When I would see him in various social settings in New York, he always said the same thing to me when I was working on Jimmy Carter. He said, "Only 1 volume?" And I said, "Yes, that's all my publisher will let me write. They're not going to give me the money for more than 1 volume." But Bob, whose work is, will live forever, is working on volume 4. Then you see Nixon books. There's no single book about Nixon that I especially love, but there's some good ones. You see Peggy Noonan's book there about Reagan, and then a book called Politics by Hendrik Hertzberg, which is not about Reagan, but it includes a number of his pieces about Reagan. He wrote for The New Yorker and other magazines. He had been Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter. And this is a collection of some of the best essays on American politics in the late 20th century that you can read anywhere. Hendrik Hertzberg, Hertzberg.
What's the title on that?
It's just Politics, Observations and Arguments,
Okay.
1966 to 2004. Then after the Reagan books, we then, on the next shelf, we start to get into some of the newer books. You see books about Biden. You see Maggie Haberman's Confidence Man, which is the best book about Trump so far. You see Hillary Clinton's account of the 2016 election that I mentioned earlier, is the book she had just come out with when she came to our house. And then on the bottom shelf, it's kind of like just a mixture of different books. A very good book about 1959 by Fred Kaplan. The one I would mention is First by Evan Thomas. And this is an outstanding biography of Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman on the Supreme Court. And then for those of you who are interested in Germany, there's a good short biography of Angela Merkel by Catie Martin. And the last book on this shelf is Billie Jean King's memoir, All In, which I would recommend. And then just very quickly, I'm going to just do a very quick pan on these shelves, just so you don't think it's all politics all the time. In the Alter household, here are some very well-worn Harry Potter books next to a bust of Franklin Roosevelt that we read to our kids, and then they read themselves. And then the collected work of William Shakespeare, volume Julius Caesar, by Shakespeare, because my next book is a political biography of Julius Caesar.
Wow.
And then down here, just more novels and other books that we like, a big, thick book about New York. But there's a book called Homeland Elegies by Ayad Akhtar. Outstanding novel, Homeland Elegies. And then next to that is one of Philip Roth's novels, and I read everything by Philip Roth. All right, let's go upstairs then. Okay, so these are our back stairs, and we have a lot of, the normal kind of family pictures, plus some, what politicians call their wall of fame. There's me and Paul McCartney after I interviewed him, and here's me and my kids with Mikhail Gorbachev and an interpreter. And this is, it so happened that in 2000, it was Take Your Children to Work Day, on the same day that I had an interview in New York with Gorbachev. Then just a lot of other family pictures, but ones that might be a little more interest. This is one that a wonderful shot of Barack Obama after when he was an Illinois state senator that was given to me by the filmmaker who made Waiting for Superman, a documentary that I was in. And this is my Martin Luther King autograph. He came to our house when I was 8 years old. My parents were Chicago liberals involved in the civil rights movement. And I guess it's fair to say that meeting Dr. King when I was 8 years old changed my life. This is a sketch of me that was drawn by the great cartoonist Mike Lukovich when we were both aboard John McCain's Straight Talk Express. Here's a citation of one of my wife, Emily Lazar's Emmys.
Wow.
There's a Shepard Fairey. We have a few Shepard Fairey Obama. I met Obama when he was in the Illinois State Senate. Obama came to my my aunt's wake. My family had a lot of connections to him. This is my son Tommy and me with the Obamas at one of the White House Christmas parties. And so, and I knew him, and I've interviewed him many times. And then this is me in one of my my interviews with Bill Clinton. That's in the small dining room right off the old Oval Office. And I interviewed Clinton 7 times when he was president, and several times before and after he was president. So this is actually my favorite picture of me and Bill Clinton in the Oval Office, because I got to sit in the chair that the foreign heads of state sit in when they bring in the photographers. So that was fun. This is a picture of me at Ground Zero on September 14th, 2001, Friday after the Tuesday. And you can see below it basically it's a part of a menu from a restaurant on the 107th floor of the World Trade Center, called the World Trade Center Club. And then also just a business document that I picked up off the ground. I later learned that the lymphoma that I got a couple of years later, stage 4 lymphoma, which I miraculously survived after a bone marrow transplant, that there's reason to believe that I, being down at Ground Zero a half dozen times in the immediate aftermath, may have hurt me. I wasn't masked at the time that I was picking these things up, and that was my fault. And I've never tried to claim any money from it or anything, but the former deputy mayor of New York, Joe Loda, who was with me and believed that he also got lymphoma from our trips to Ground Zero, alerted me to that. So I mentioned earlier that my mentor was a guy named Charlie Peters, and this is Charlie Peters with me and Greg Easterbrook, an outstanding journalist and author in the early 1980s. And Charlie was one of the most influential magazine editors of the 20th century.
What made him so influential?
Well, the Washington Monthly, which was founded in 1969, was and is a liberal magazine, but it challenges the means of achieving liberal ends. And so I found in the files of Jimmy Carter, I found underlined copies of the Washington Monthly. Much of the political orientation of, Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter, Jim Fallows, came out of the Washington Monthly. Michael Kinsley, legendary editor of the New Republic and Harper's and founder of Slate, came out of the Washington Monthly. John Meacham came out of the Washington Monthly. Kate Boo, celebrated Pulitzer Prize winning writer. Taylor Branch, the Pulitzer Prize winning biographer of Martin Luther King. Many others. James Bennett, who was the editorial page editor of the New York Times. Nicholas Lemon, New Yorker writer who became dean of Columbia Journalism School. A long list, and leaving out a lot of important journalists who came out of this tiny magazine, founded and edited by Charlie Peters, and still going strong under the editorship of Paul Glastras. So sometimes small magazines can have big influence. That was true of the New Republic in the Wilson administration when Walter Lippmann was writing for the New Republic.
Was that true during Clinton?
Well, I think Clinton's chief speechwriter, Michael Waldman, was another person who came out of the Washington Monthly. So there were, and Paul Glastras, the current editor of the Washington Monthly, was a Bill Clinton speechwriter. So yes, the Washington Monthly had important influence in the Clinton administration, and then Jason DeParle, in his writing on welfare, had a big influence on both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama in his writing on various subjects. So these small magazines, if they catch the wave right, they punch way above their weight. So when I mentioned my late mother, you might want to, that's a nice picture of her. And when I mentioned my parents, those are my parents. This is my office on the third floor of our house in Montclair. And I write my books mostly in here. Here on the walls are some cartoons from a 19th century magazine called Judge. I also have some Puck cartoons, another 19th century magazine. There's my lovely wife, Emily Lazar, and Catherine Graham there on the cover of Newsweek after she died. And I worked for Newsweek for 28 years when Kay Graham was the Queen of Washington, the proprietor of the Washington Post and Newsweek, and I was proud to work for her. Here are just more books, mostly nonfiction, just to give you a little bit of a sense of the more books in this office, more than I'm guessing, but well over 1,000 altogether. I have no idea exactly how many. At the time when I'm in the middle of a book, this floor here is just covered with books. So when I was writing about Jimmy Carter, it was covered with books stacked up about the 1970s, books that mentioned Carter that I might use for my research, although more of my research was done at the Carter Library in Atlanta and in interviews with Carter. Caesar, my Caesar books, there are a bunch of them, are downstairs in our bedroom, but I'm not gonna let you in there because.
Can we get another shot of the desk from this perspective?
Yeah. So, and here's the desk where I write most of my books. I sometimes work in our bedroom on our laptop, but a lot of them up here. And here on the ground is a book I want to let you know about. It's the Doonesbury Retrospective. This is the collection that Gary Trudeau, the author of Doonesbury, had published on the 40th anniversary of Doonesbury in 2010. He had another similar retrospective on the 50th anniversary in 2020. And here's one of my Doonesbury strips that Gary gave me. I also have some of his original uninked Doonesburys, and Gary and I were business partners and co-executive producers on Amazon's first TV show, a comedy called Alpha House, starring John Goodman, and about 4 Republican senators who live in a man cave on Capitol Hill. And that was really fun TV experience for me. Gary wrote the episodes, and it was his show. I was just helping him out.
Had he done TV before?
A little bit, but he did Tanner 88 with Robert Altman, which was terrific. And then I was able to help him sell Alpha House to Amazon. And we shot and aired 21 episodes. But I think the reason that I want to dwell on Gary for a minute, not just because he's a wonderful guy, but because I don't really think you can understand the 1970s in particular, but anything about American political and cultural life from 1970 to the present without reading Doonesbury. Not all the strips, there's thousands of them, but there was just a great one about Trump on this past Sunday. So nowadays, Gary, you used to write strip 7 days a week. Now, 6 days are reruns, but he does an original every Sunday, and it is as good as ever. So, look what's on my desk. So this you might find this interesting. So recently, I was contacted by somebody who is writing about the 1970s in New York, and I told him that when I was making Breslin and Hamill, I contacted David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, and trying to get an interview with him, and he declined an interview. But he was a serial killer, maybe the most famous in the history of New York, and it's called The Son of Sam. And he didn't agree to an interview, but this is the letter that he wrote me that I spilled a cup of coffee on. Dear Mr. Alter, I have no memory of what was written other than a letter being sent. Best wishes. I'm sorry I cannot be of further help. Sincerely, David Berkowitz, in Sullivan Correctional Facility, Fallsburg, New York.
Wow.
And Jimmy Breslin had become even more famous during this case because Berkowitz, when he was at large, sent Breslin, then a columnist for the New York Daily News, these terrifying, chilling letters. He says, this is an interesting line here for people who are interested, and I imagine most people are. Other than a letter sent to Mr. Breslin when he was with the Daily News, I have no other connection to him. Thinking back, I cannot even remember why Mr. Breslin was sent a letter in the first place, or what its contents was. I believe I was very delusional and even psychotic during this tragic and troubled time in my life.
Wow.
So anyway, I've done a lot of interviews with 9 American presidents and Jimmy Hoffa when I was in high school, and a lot of other people, but that was one that got away. I wish I had interviewed David Berkowitz. This is one of the bedrooms in our house, and it's where we have our busts. So that's Washington, Lincoln, FDR, JFK, and LBJ. And the Lincoln one has special memories for me because I got it when I was probably 6 years old. It's a plaster bust. And I remember growing up in Chicago when my father would have us do fire drills. And he said, you can take one thing as we're leaving the house if there's a fire. And I said, well, I'm taking that Lincoln bust.
I like it.
Here's just very quickly, just to give you a sense of, how many more books we have in this house. So here's a bunch more books and more books, and it's kind of endless. This might interest you. This is a World War I recruitment poster that I got at a flea market in New Jersey, featuring the former governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson. You can see Lincoln is on there too, and they're trying to put Wilson in league with Lincoln. And actually, at the time, he was. And he was considered for much of the 20th century to be one of our greatest presidents. And he's now in very bad odor. If you're interested in Wilson, there's a good book by A. Scott Berg. And then there's some newer, much more critical books about Woodrow Wilson that have come out recently and that make a good point about what a racist he was and how certain of his other qualities did not serve the United States well. All right. I missed my 3 o'clock. All right, I'm going to hurry. When I show you in the den, when I show you the bumper rabbit, here's the bumper goat. Press credential from the 1940 Democratic Convention. A lot nicer than the press credentials I used in all the conventions I went to after that. And I do have, some Nixons here. There's another little Lincoln bust. I do have Nixon here. I don't have any likenesses of Donald Trump in my house, and I don't plan to. These are some of my media books. The one that I would most recommend is Marjorie Williams, The Woman at the Washington Zoo, which is a collection of brilliant essays about Washington, mostly in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s. Book at the End of the Road by Russell Baker, who was a amusing, wonderful New York Times columnist. Here are some of my religious books. Mm-hmm. There's a wonderful biography of Jerusalem by Simon Sebag Montefiore that everybody should read before they go to the Middle East.
Why is it called a biography?
He decided to call it a biography in the same way that Karen Armstrong, a couple of books down to the right, she basically wrote a biography of God. And Simon Sebag Montefiore wrote a biography of a city. And I guess what he meant was that he was doing a book about a city, but mostly about the people in that city. So, but it's really terrific. And then The Abandonment of the Jews is an early book about a U.S. policy during the Holocaust, which is quite damning, especially of some people in the State Department. Roosevelt's State Department. The last one is by the late Walter Shapiro, a friend, and it's about how a relative of his, household Adolf Hitler, basically scammed the Nazis. Thomas Deitch's The Third Coast is a book about Chicago. Subtitle is When Chicago Built the American Dream, and it's about mid-century Chicago. Wonderful, evocative, cultural, intellectual history of Chicago. Andrew Solomon's Far from the Tree, where he spends a lot of time with the parents of one of the Columbine killers and other people who have had to deal with relatives who did heinous things. Fantastic book. Then I think some of you might be familiar with Jeffrey Toobin's The Run of His Life, about the O.J. Simpson case. And I was lucky enough to attend one day of the Simpson trial in Los Angeles. And Jeff Toobin, who's a terrific writer on legal issues, great storyteller, delivers the goods in that book. That's the best book to read about O.J. Bruce Springsteen's memoirs, which are quite interesting. Then a book by Bill Clinton, his most recent book, which is a very candid memoir of his post-presidential life, which is very undervalued. I reviewed it recently in the Washington Post, and it's worth a read. It's very defensive, but still.
I don't know if you mentioned. I don't know if you have the Springsteen and Obama book. That's pretty good, also.
Oh, I don't have that. So now I would also recommend that people read about Admiral Rickover, extremely important historical figure who built the nuclear navy, which Colin Powell and others believe won the Cold War for the United States because we had nuclear-powered subs and they didn't. He was a crotchety, crusty, in some ways very unlikable character, but important and in Jimmy Carter's life and important in the development of the most exciting technological project of the middle part of the 20th century.
That part of your biography of Carter actually stuck out to me on Rickover and just sort of his experience working with that kind of stuff. Kind of showed you the level of intellect he had.
Yeah, I'm glad it did.
Is the Nancy Reagan Kitty Kelly book good?
Kitty Kelly is being a tabloid writer, but she's a terrific reporter, and most of what she gets is juicy but true.